in order to grant access to the Google Ads API, what we'll need to do is create a server to handle this OAuth flow. I'm going to be coding in Python today, and we're going to use a Python Flask server. Flask is an awesome microserver framework. There are a lot of advanced features. I'm going to try to keep this as bare bones as possible rather than displaying views and all this different stuff. I'm, for the most part, just going to use JSON and redirects. Part of the reason I'm doing this is no matter what language you're coding in, what framework you're using, or even if you're not using a framework, it should be pretty easy to take these concepts and apply it to your application. First thing I'll do is just create a virtual environment, and we are in our virtual environment. So from here, we're just going to create a couple files. So let's head back into our code editor, setup.py, and just create a project for local development. And head back here. As I mentioned, we'll be using Flask, which is an awesome microserver framework. Head on over to the Flask documentation. It's a little quick start guide. It's super easy to use, but the first thing we need to do is pip install Flask, so we have it. And this is how you use it. So we define our route. Rather than just a plain old route, we're going to have an authorized route. And what this is going to do is redirect the user to that login page where they can grant access. Once they've hit allow, we'll have a separate route called OAuth to callback that parses the parameters, namely a code parameter and a state parameter, to A, check that the user who initiated the request is the one actually making this OAuth to callback request, and then more importantly, using that code in order to generate a refresh token, which we need in order to make API requests. So, authorize, we'll just call this authorize endpoint, and we will return a redirect to the URL we haven't created yet. In order to use redirect, we'll just import redirect here. How do we get that URL? URL equals, don't know. We'll get there. The next thing we'll do is write the method in order to generate that URL. So within our server, let's create a new folder, call it auth. And we'll create auth.py. And in this file, we're going to have a function called authorize that generates both that URL as well as a what's called a pass-through value or a state anti-forgery state token. I'll explain that in just a moment. So in order to do this, I'm not going to write this from scratch. We've got some great resources. So if you head on over to the Google Ads Python library, we have an example called Generate User Credentials. And if you wanted, you can just run this example by following the directions herein, and it'll spit out a refresh token that you can use to make API calls. It's a lot easier than what we're doing now. The problem is when you're running this in the context of a multi-tenant web app in which you need to both generate and retrieve credentials on the fly, this won't exactly work, which is why we're kind of adapting this to our purposes. So let's take a look here. And I'm going to just copy and paste some things here. So first thing, I'm going to just grab some of these variables. So scope, this is the scope that our refresh token will have access to. So we've already said that we have access to basic profile information. This is how we say also grant access to the Google Ads API. This is the scope for that. The server, this will be the server for the redirect URI, so that OAuth to callback that's going to actually parse the response and generate the refresh token. This is going to be what the Flask server is running on, and I also happen to know ahead of time that the port we'll be using is 5000, and the redirect URI that we haven't set up yet, OAuth to callback. Let's go ahead and just create a route. Auth to callback. And this will return a redirect just back to our client URL. which we know is localhost 4200. So to walk through the flow, our application is going to go to this authorize endpoint, which will then redirect to this endpoint with a code parameter, and then we'll parse that code parameter and generate a refresh token, save it, and just go back to the client application. So let's go ahead and write our authorize method. Again, I'm just going to borrow from this library. I come in here, and you can see here, what this does is it creates an instance of this flow class, which is a kind of an authorization helper library in Python. We set the redirect URI. We create this pass-through value, which you can read more about here. It's an anti-forgery state token. We'll take that pass-through value, save it to our session, and then when we hit that auth to callback route, we'll grab it from our session, and there'll also be a parameter called state. We'll compare the two, and if they're the same, we know it's a valid request. Okay, with that, we can just call this authorization URL helper method, and ultimately, all we'll do here is return a dictionary with authorization URL equal to authorization URL and pass-through value equal to pass-through value. So as you can see, we have a few things here that need to be defined. Let's knock the easiest ones out first. So scopes, it's just going to be a list of scope. Flow. In order to get access to this, you can just import this library directly, but this is a dependency of the Google Ads API, and since we'll be using the Google Ads API later on, I know I can just install the Google Ads client library from pip and resolve that dependency. So I'll pip install Google Ads. Any moment now. There we go. That means we need to import this. And we'll also need both of these. And that leaves one more item, which is our client secrets path. So our client secrets path will be equal to a variable we're going to name client secrets path. And we'll say that is equal to an environment variable, which we haven't set yet, but we're going to call it client secrets path. And this is a path to a JSON file containing information about your auth credentials in Cloud Project. And that's what ties these specific credentials to this specific login flow and a refresh token. So instead of this, we can just copy and paste. That should be all good and well, but we haven't set this yet. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to head back into our Cloud project. And as I mentioned before, there's this handy JSON file. I'm going to say export client secrets path equals users .chess. You probably want to save this somewhere that you'll keep it and makes more sense, but it downloaded to my downloads folder, so I'm going to use the current location. Okay, so let's just cat out client secrets path, see what we get. And now this route is all set. So now what we're going to do is head back over to our server from auth, import authorize. And we'll just create a variable called auth_info equals authorize. Now we know our pass-through value is equal to auth_info pass-through val, and our URL is equal to auth_info authorization URL. We will save this to a session, so we'll import session from Flask. Session, type this a few times, pass-through value equals pass-through value. And whenever you use sessions in Flask, you have to use a secret key to encrypt the data. You should use an actual secret key. In production, this is just a test and a demo, so I'm just going to leave a placeholder for now. And now you can see with our authorize endpoint, we have our auth info from our authorize. We save our pass-through value to a session, and then our URL is redirected to, and that is simply going to be this OAuth 2 callback with some parameters. If we come back here, we know that we're going to want our pass-through value again. We will also want to get some parameters from the request, so we'll import request as well. And we know that state is one of those. Yes, that's going to be request.args.get state. And then our code, which is the access code, is going to be equal to request.args.get code. We'll call a new method called OAuth, our new function, to callback with our pass-through value, state, and our code. After that, we'll just return to client application. That should do it. However, we haven't written this method yet, so let's go ahead and do that. Back over to auth. As I said, this is going to take a pass-through val, which is going to be equal to this value, state, which is going to come off of the parameter, and also the access code, which is what we need in order to generate the refresh token. Now, if we head back to our example in the client library, there's a lot going on here. It opens up a new socket to actually receive this callback. We don't need to do that because we're actually running a server, so we just set up that endpoint ourselves. The important things I want to point out are these two lines, which is how we actually generate the refresh token, and also this check right here, that if the state does not equal the pass-through value, we'll just raise an error. If pass-through val does not equal state, then we will simply raise that same error. However, if they do match, I'm just going to recreate these. There's probably a more efficient way to do this, but live demo, so let's go ahead and just paste that in for the sake of speed. And then, as I mentioned before, getting the refresh token is very easy. That's it. So now we've generated our refresh token. We're not doing anything with it yet. We eventually will save it to a secret manager, but with that, let's head back over to our server, make sure this all looks good, which it does. In order to run a Flask application, just check out the quick start guide. Pretty simple. So we'll just say export Flask app as server, export. I'm going to run this in development mode. So we get hot reloading, some error message help, and Flask run. Cool. So now it's running on 127.0.0.1 port 5000. However, we don't have any mechanism to actually hit that endpoint. So let's go ahead back into our index.js file, and we'll create a simple button with an on-click handler equal to on-link account, on-link ads account, link Google Ads account, head back over to app.js, function, and we're just going to redirect server URL equals HTTP 27.0.0.1 slash, that's it, and we will have that equal to /authorize. All right, now with all of that up and running, theoretically our app should just work. Let's give it a whirl. All right, so we already have access to this basic information. We actually don't need that in order to do this next step, but we'll tie the two together in the final step, which is the secret manager. So if I link Google Ads account, this should hopefully, maybe I just need to add the port. Let's try that again. Ah, all right, cool. And now it's taking me to this page, which is saying there's an authorization error. There's a redirect URI mismatch. Now this is a pretty easy fix. So as you recall, in our server, we're redirecting to a URL, which is this URI. So in order to redirect to URI with those parameters, what we need to do is add an authorized redirect URI to our OAuth credentials. So let's go ahead and do that together. So down here, authorized redirect URIs, this 127.0.0.1, port 5000, OAuth to callback. Save. It says it takes about 5 minutes, but in my experience, it's pretty much instant. So let's give it a whirl. Okay. Okay, and now it is. So this is the URL that it took us to. As you can see here, it has some information, and it's asking me to log in. I will click yes. Now we're presented with this page. I promised I would explain this later. Now it's later. So what this is saying is Google hasn't verified this app, and the reason we're getting this is because the scope of the Google Ads API is considered what's called sensitive. So in order to use this scope, you have to go through a verification process, and the steps to do that are outlined in the Cloud Console, but it's really about explaining who you are, how you'll use the API access and so forth, just making sure it's completely transparent to users. However, this is just a test demo app, so I'm not going to go through that verification process. If you're in this position, you can simply just hit advanced, go to app, and now we're at this page where it's saying, we were here earlier, we want to manage your AdWords campaigns, and we can see the 3 services we already have access to. Now once I hit continue, it's going to redirect to that OAuth to callback with those parameters that I mentioned earlier. Hit continue, and now we're getting an error saying that the scope has changed just AdWords to all of these different things. Now this is a warning, and what it's saying is that if you recall, we set our scope variable up here, but because in the initial page here, it's logging in, it got basic profile information. Now, if we go back to our security tab, manage access, we can see it actually did grant access to the Google Ads account, but it didn't save it didn't generate the refresh token, it seems. And if we look at our Visual Studio Code, there actually is a line in here that says include granted scopes, which means this incremental access should be granted. However, there is this warning, and in order to suppress it, thankfully I've done some research ahead of time, and there is one parameter. If you set this environment variable equal to 1, it will suppress that. So let's give this another try. Link Google Ads account, come in here, advanced, go to Google Ads Test App. You can see it actually does have 4 services now, but we'll hit continue, and we're back. And that is it for this step. So now you can see if we come here, it's given us all the access. Let's say we remove the access again just to give it one more try. We reload this page. We'll continue as Devin, let that load, link Google Ads account, sign in, advanced, go to Google Ads. It's managing 3 services, continue, and we're back.